which, you should have never come. That was the first thing my daughter-in-law said to me that night, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear, just seconds before my plate slid off the table and shattered across the polished floor. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I didn't even look at her right away. I just sat there, hands resting lightly on the table, feeling every pair of eyes in that room slowly turn toward me as the sound of broken porcelain faded into a heavy, suffocating silence. It was supposed to be a quiet dinner. That's what Daniel had told me on the phone 2 days earlier. Just something small, Mom, he said. Ashley found this new place downtown. Thought we could all try it together. I remember hesitating before I agreed. Not because I didn't want to see my son, but because something in his voice felt rehearsed, like he was reading from a script he hadn't written. Still, I said yes. I always said yes. I arrived 10 minutes early, the way I always did, smoothing the front of my navy blue dress as I stepped into the restaurant. It was one of those places with soft amber lighting and white tablecloths that looked too pristine to touch. A pianist was playing something slow in the corner, and the air smelled faintly of butter and rosemary. For a moment, standing there alone, I allowed myself to believe this might be a good night. That maybe, just maybe, things between us could feel normal again. Daniel and Ashley were already seated when the hostess led me over. Ashley didn't stand up. She didn't smile either. She just glanced at me the way someone might glance at a misplaced object, something that didn't quite belong where it had been left. Daniel gave me a quick nod, the kind you give a neighbor you don't know very well. Mom, he said. That was it. I sat down across from them, folding my hands in my lap, pretending not to notice the way Ashley's eyes lingered on me a second too long, as if she were measuring something. The conversation never really started. Daniel scrolled through his phone between bites of bread. Ashley spoke only when she had to, her voice light but distant, like she was performing politeness instead of feeling it. I tried to fill the silence. I asked about Daniel's work. I complimented Ashley's jacket. I even mentioned a recipe I thought she might like. Each word felt like it disappeared the moment it left my mouth, swallowed by the space between us. When the food arrived, I felt a small, foolish flicker of relief. Something to focus on. Something normal. My plate was set down carefully in front of me, the steam rising in gentle curls. I picked up my fork, my hand steady, and that's when it happened. Ashley leaned forward, her movement so smooth it almost looked deliberate, and with one quick motion, she knocked the edge of my plate. It didn't fly across the room. It didn't crash dramatically. It just tipped, slid, then fell. The sound it made when it hit the floor was sharp and final. Conversations around us paused. The pianist missed a note. For a second, no one moved. Then came her voice. Which, you should have never come. It wasn't shouted in anger. It was spoken clearly, almost casually, like she'd been waiting for the right moment to say it. I looked at her then, really looked, and what I saw wasn't rage. It wasn't even irritation. It was something colder, something practiced. My first instinct was to apologize, the habit of a lifetime rising up before I could stop it. But the words didn't come. Instead, I became aware of something else. The way the couple at the next table had turned their chairs slightly. The way a waiter had stopped mid-step, his eyes fixed on us. The way Daniel still hadn't said a single word. I turned to him slowly. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the table, his jaw tight, his fingers curled loosely around his glass like he didn't know what to do with his hands. Daniel, I said quietly. He didn't respond. Ashley leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, her expression settling into something almost satisfied. Honestly, she added, shaking her head slightly. Some people just don't know when they're not welcome. The room didn't return to normal. Not right away. The silence stretched, thin and uncomfortable, broken only by the soft clinking of dishes from the kitchen and the faint hum of the air conditioning. I placed my napkin neatly beside my untouched utensils. My hands were calm. Too calm. I noticed that. The absence of trembling. The absence of panic. It was as if something inside me had gone very still, very clear. I stood up slowly, smoothing my dress again, the same small gesture I'd made when I walked in. No one stopped me. No one said anything. Not even Daniel. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of Ashley's reflection in the glass panel near the entrance. She was watching me, not with anger, not with guilt, but with a kind of quiet anticipation, like she was waiting to see what I would do next. And in that moment, something didn't feel right. Not the insult, not the broken plate, Those things, as painful as they were, made a certain kind of sense. What didn't make sense was her timing, her composure, the way everything had unfolded so cleanly, so precisely, as if it had been arranged ahead of time. I stepped outside into the cool night air, the sound of the city rushing back and around me. Cars passing, distant laughter, the ordinary world continuing as if nothing had happened. I took a slow breath, letting it out carefully, and for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to think one simple, unsettling thought. This wasn't a loss of control. It was a performance, and I had just played my part exactly the way she wanted. I did not go home right away. That surprised me more than anything else. For years, my instincts had always been predictable. I would leave, quietly, return to my house, make a cup of tea, and sit in the same chair by the window until the world felt less sharp. But that night, my feet did not follow that familiar path. I stood on the sidewalk just outside the restaurant, watching the reflection of the entrance in the glass across the street, as if I were waiting for something to reveal itself. People came and went. Laughter spilled out each time the door opened. Life continued as though nothing unusual had happened inside. And yet, I could not shake the feeling that what I had just experienced was not spontaneous. It had been arranged, measured, timed. I replayed the moment in my mind, not focusing on the words, but on the details I would have once ignored. The way Ashley had leaned forward before touching the plate. Not abruptly, not clumsily. It had been controlled, almost graceful. The way her voice had not trembled, not even slightly, when she spoke. And most of all, the way she had watched me afterward, as if she were not reacting to the moment, but evaluating it. That was when I realized something unsettling. She had not been surprised by my silence. She had expected it. I began walking slowly down the block, my heels clicking softly against the pavement. The night air was cool, steady, grounding. Each step seemed to clear a little of the fog from my mind. If this had been planned, then it had a purpose. And if it had a purpose, then I needed to understand what that purpose was. I reached the corner and paused, glancing back once more. Through the window, I could see our table. Daniel was still sitting there. Ashley was speaking now, leaning slightly toward him, her expression calm, almost reassuring. He nodded once, slowly, not confused, not upset, just compliant. That hurt more than anything she had said. I turned away and kept walking. A few doors down, I noticed a small bench near a row of neatly trimmed hedges. I sat down carefully, smoothing my dress again out of habit, even though there was no one there to see me. I rested my hands in my lap and allowed myself to think clearly for the first time. There had been signs. I could see that now. Not loud ones, not obvious ones, but small, consistent shifts that I had dismissed at the time. Invitations that stopped coming. Phone calls that grew shorter. Conversations that felt rehearsed, like Daniel was always choosing his words too carefully. And Ashley, always polite, always composed, but never warm. Never once had she treated me like someone who belonged in her life. I had told myself it was just personality, that not everyone expressed affection the same way, that relationships took time. But time had only made things colder. A memory surfaced, quiet but persistent. 2 months ago, at their house, I had arrived with a pie I had spent the entire morning baking. Apple, his favorite. Daniel had smiled when he saw it, but Ashley had taken it from my hands before he could say much. She had thanked me, of course. Her tone perfect, her smile flawless. Then she had placed it on the counter without another glance, as if it were something that could be dealt with later. We never ate it. That evening had ended the same way so many others had, with me leaving early, telling myself they were just busy, that I should not take it personally. I exhaled slowly, the memory settling into place beside the others. It had never been about being busy. It had been about control. Control of the environment. Control of Daniel. And, slowly, control of how I was perceived within that space. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. That steadiness felt different now. Not like numbness. More like clarity. I reached into my purse and took out my phone, holding it for a moment before unlocking the screen. I was not entirely sure what I was looking for, but something told me I needed to start paying attention to details I had overlooked before. My messages with Daniel were brief, polite, functional. My messages with Ashley were even shorter, almost non-existent. That alone said more than I had ever allowed myself to admit. Then I remembered something else. The way the waiter had stopped. The way he had looked at the table, not with confusion, but with recognition. as if he had seen something like that before. That thought lingered. I closed my phone and slipped it back into my purse, my mind already beginning to connect pieces I had not realized were connected. If tonight had been a performance, then there might have been an audience that knew the script. I stood up again, slower this time, my movements deliberate. The woman who had walked into that restaurant had been hoping for something to mend. The woman standing here now was no longer hoping. She was observing. I began walking again, this time with a clearer sense of direction, even if I could not yet see the full path ahead. I did not feel angry, not in the way people expect. There was no urge to confront, no impulse to demand explanations. What I felt instead was something quieter, more precise. A need to understand. Because whatever Ashley had intended to achieve that night, she had not finished. I could see that now, and neither had I. I did not return home until much later that night, long after the restaurants had closed and the streets had grown quieter, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel deliberate, as if the world itself is paying closer attention. When I finally stepped inside my house, I did not turn on all the lights the way I usually would. I left the entryway dim, just a single lamp casting a soft glow across the hardwood floor, and I set my purse down gently on the side table, as though any sudden movement might disturb the clarity I had begun to feel. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, familiar and steady, but something about it felt different now. Not colder, not emptier, just clearer. I moved slowly into the kitchen, filling a glass with water instead of making tea, and stood there for a moment, watching the reflection of my own hands in the darkened window. They were still steady. That detail continued to stand out to me, as if my body had already decided something my mind was only beginning to understand. I carried the glass into the living room and sat down in my usual chair, the one by the window, but I did not lean back. I sat upright, alert, replaying everything again, not from the perspective of someone hurt, but from the perspective of someone observing a pattern. Because that was what it was. A pattern. And patterns, once recognized, have a way of revealing more than any single moment ever could. I thought about the restaurant again, not the insult, not the broken plate, but the details surrounding it. The timing of the dinner. The choice of location. The way Daniel had called instead of texting, his voice slightly too careful. The fact that Ashley had not stood up when I arrived, as though she had already decided the tone of the evening before it began. And then there was the moment itself. The way the room had reacted. Not just surprise, but something else. Something closer to familiarity. That thought returned again, stronger this time. Familiarity. As if what had happened was not entirely unexpected to the people who worked there. I set the glass down on the small table beside me and reached for my phone again, this time with a clearer intention. I opened my contacts and scrolled slowly, stopping when I reached a name I had not called in over a year. Linda Parker. She had been a neighbor years ago, before she moved downtown. We had stayed in touch loosely, exchanging holiday cards, occasional updates. I remembered she had mentioned working part-time at a restaurant after her retirement, something to stay active. I hesitated for only a moment before pressing call. The line rang twice before she answered, her voice warm, surprised, but unmistakably familiar. We spoke briefly, exchanging the usual pleasantries, but I did not take long to reach the reason for my call. I mentioned the restaurant by name, careful to keep my tone neutral, almost casual. There was a pause on the other end. Not long, but long enough to confirm what I had begun to suspect. Linda did not ask why I was asking. She did not sound confused. Instead, her voice lowered slightly, as if she were choosing her words with care. She told me she did not work there regularly, only filling in occasionally, but she knew the place, knew the staff, knew the kind of clientele it attracted. Then she said something that settled heavily into the space between us. They have had situations there before, she said slowly. Nothing that gets reported. Just uncomfortable scenes, usually involving the same group of people. I did not interrupt. I did not ask her to clarify. I simply listened. She continued, explaining that certain guests had a reputation for drawing attention, for creating moments that disrupted the calm atmosphere the restaurant tried to maintain. Not loud arguments, not chaos, but something more controlled, more intentional, like they want people to notice, she added quietly. That was when everything shifted into place. Not completely, not yet, but enough to change the shape of what I was looking at. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat there for a long moment, letting the silence return. The room felt different now. Not heavy, not overwhelming, just precise. I leaned back slightly, folding my hands together, and allowed the realization to settle fully. This had not been the first time Ashley had done something like this. And if it had not been the first time, then it had been practiced, refined, used. The question was not why she had done it. Not yet. The question was what she had gained from it. Attention, certainly. Control, most likely. But there was something else. Something more deliberate. Because involving Daniel, placing him in that position, had not been necessary for a simple display. It had served a purpose. I stood up again, moving toward the hallway where a small cabinet held old documents, photographs, things I had not needed to revisit in years. I opened it slowly, not searching for anything specific, but following the quiet instinct that had guided me all evening. Inside were folders neatly stacked, labeled in my own handwriting. Financial papers, property records, copies of documents Daniel had once helped me organize after his father passed. I paused there, my fingers resting lightly on one of the folders, and felt that same stillness return, stronger this time. Because suddenly, the pattern was no longer just about behavior. It was about timing. And timing, in matters like this, is never accidental. I closed the cabinet without taking anything out, my mind already moving ahead, connecting pieces I had not yet fully examined. Whatever Ashley was doing, it was not impulsive. It was structured, and structures, once built, always leave traces. I returned to the living room, the quiet of the house now feeling less like solitude and more like space. Space to think. Space to see clearly. I sat down once more, this time allowing myself to lean back, my eyes resting on the dark window across from me. My reflection looked the same as it had earlier that evening. But I was not the same woman who had walked into that restaurant. Not anymore. Because now, I was no longer asking whether I had done something wrong. I was asking a much more important question. What exactly had she been preparing for? And why had I only just been invited to see it? I did not sleep much that night, but it was not restlessness that kept me awake. It was clarity, the kind that settles in slowly and refuses to leave once it arrives. I remained in my chair longer than I realized, the house quiet around me, the clock on the wall marking each passing minute with steady precision. And somewhere between those moments, the past began to rearrange itself into something I could finally understand. It was not one event. It was never just one event. It was a sequence, carefully spaced, each piece small enough to dismiss on its own, but together forming something deliberate. I closed my eyes briefly, not to escape the memory, but to see it more clearly, and the first image that came back to me was from nearly a year ago, a Sunday afternoon at their house, sunlight coming through the kitchen windows, everything appearing warm, normal, even peaceful at first glance. Ashley had been preparing lunch, moving around the kitchen with that same controlled grace I had seen at the restaurant, every motion efficient, measured, almost rehearsed. Daniel had been sitting at the counter, speaking to me about something minor, something I cannot even recall now, because what stayed with me was not his words, but the way Ashley interrupted him, gently at first, then more firmly, correcting him on a detail that did not matter. He had stopped mid-sentence, smiled awkwardly, and adjusted what he said to match her version. I remember noticing it, but only for a second. I had told myself it was nothing. That couples do that. That it was normal. Now, sitting in the quiet of my living room, I understood that it had not been about the detail. It had been about control. I opened my eyes again, staring at the reflection in the window, and let another memory surface. A family gathering 3 months ago, small, informal, just a few relatives. I had arrived with a gift for Daniel, something simple, a watch I had saved for, wrapped carefully in a box I had chosen myself. When I handed it to him, his expression had softened, just for a moment, the way it used to when he was younger, before everything became filtered through someone else's approval. But before he could open it, Ashley had stepped in, her hand lightly resting on his arm, her smile polite but firm. "We are not doing gifts today," she had said, her tone light enough to sound reasonable, but final enough that there was no room for discussion. Daniel had hesitated, then nodded, setting the box aside without opening it. No one else had said anything. I had smiled, of course. I always smiled. I told myself it was not important, that there would be another time. There never was. The watch was still in its box somewhere in their house, unopened, just like so many other gestures I had made that never quite reached their intended place. I shifted slightly in my chair, my hands resting calmly together, and let the pattern continue to unfold. Invitations that arrived late, if they arrived at all. Changes in plans that I was informed of, not included in. Conversations where my presence felt more like an obligation than a choice. None of it loud. None of it openly hostile. Just enough distance, just enough redirection, to slowly move me out of the center of my own family and into the margins where I could be acknowledged without ever being included. And then there was Daniel. That was the part one had avoided looking at directly for the longest time. It was easier to believe he was simply busy, distracted, overwhelmed by work or life or responsibilities. But the truth was quieter than that. He had been adapting, adjusting, learning, slowly, how to exist within the structure Ashley was building around him. I remembered the way he had started to pause before answering my questions, as if measuring his responses against something unseen. The way he would glance at her, almost instinctively, before making a decision, even about the smallest things. Those were not coincidences. Those were signs. And I had seen them. I just had not allowed myself to understand them. I stood up again, moving toward the window, my reflection growing clearer as I approached, the dim light outlining the lines on my face, the steadiness in my posture. I did not look like someone who had been pushed aside. I looked like someone who had been waiting without realizing it. Waiting for the pattern to become undeniable. Waiting for the moment when the pieces could no longer be explained away as misunderstandings or differences in personality. And that moment had come, not with a quiet omission, but with something public, something undeniable, something that forced me to stop interpreting and start seeing. I turned slightly, looking back toward the cabinet in the hallway, the one I had opened earlier. The documents inside were not just records. They were connections, timelines, evidence of decisions made, changes implemented, roles shifted. I had trusted Daniel with those details once, after his father passed, believing that sharing responsibility meant strengthening our bond. But now, I could not ignore the possibility that those same details had been passed along, interpreted, perhaps even reshaped into something that served a different purpose. I walked toward the cabinet again, slower this time, my steps deliberate, my thoughts steady. I did not open it right away. Instead, I stood there for a moment, considering what it meant to move from observation to action. Because once I opened that door again, once I began to look at those papers with the clarity I now had, there would be no returning to the comfort of not knowing. And yet, that comfort had already been taken from me. I reached for the handle, my hand steady, and this time, when I opened the cabinet, I did not hesitate. I was no longer looking for reassurance. I was looking for truth. And for the first time in a very long time, I was ready to see it exactly as it was. I did not rush through the documents. That was the first thing I changed. In the past, I would have skimmed, looking only for reassurance, something familiar to confirm that everything was still in its place. But that night, I moved slowly, deliberately, letting each page settle in front of me before turning to the next. The cabinet smelled faintly of paper and time, a quiet reminder of years I had spent building something I believed was secure, something I believed would hold even after I was no longer the one managing it. I pulled out the first folder, the one labeled with the year after my husband passed, and placed it carefully on the small table beside me. Inside were bank statements, property records, and a series of documents that detailed how certain responsibilities had been transferred to Daniel. I remembered the conversations clearly now, the way I had sat across from him at this very table, explaining each account, each decision, trusting him not just because he was my son, but because I believed he understood the weight of what he was being given. I had not noticed then how quiet Ashley had been during those discussions, sitting just slightly off to the side, listening without interrupting, her presence almost easy to forget. But she had been there, watching, learning. I turned the first few pages, noting dates, signatures, small annotations I had made in the margins. Nothing unusual at first. Everything appeared exactly as it should. But patterns do not reveal themselves all at once. They emerge in fragments, in details that seem insignificant until they are placed beside something else. I reached for another folder, this one more recent, and opened it with the same steady care. The difference was subtle, but it was there. Changes in account access. Adjustments to contact information. A shift in mailing addresses that I did not remember approving directly. None of it dramatic. None of it enough to raise immediate concern on its own. But together, they formed a quiet movement, a gradual redirection of information and control. I leaned back slightly, holding one of the pages in my hands, reading it again, not for the numbers, but for the context. The date caught my attention. It aligned with a memory I had just revisited earlier, the gathering where the gift had been set aside, the moment where something small had been dismissed with quiet authority. I placed the page down and reached for another, tracing the timeline without rushing. Each document felt like a piece of a conversation I had not realized was happening, a conversation I had not been fully included in. And then I saw it. Not a single line or a bold statement, but a combination of details that, when viewed together, became impossible to ignore. A change in beneficiary designation. A note indicating that future correspondence should be directed through Daniel, with an additional contact listed beneath his name. Ashley Collins. The addition was written neatly, formally, as though it had always belonged there. I stared at it for a moment, not with shock, but with recognition. This was not sudden. This had been introduced gradually, layered into the structure over time, each step small enough to pass without question, each adjustment framed as practical, reasonable, even helpful. I closed the folder gently, my movements controlled, my thoughts sharpening. This was not about taking something outright. It was about positioning, about ensuring that when decisions needed to be made, when authority needed to be exercised, the pathways would already lead where she wanted them to go. I stood up and walked to the window again. The night still stretched quietly outside, unchanged, steady. Inside, everything felt different now. Not uncertain, not confusing, just clear. I thought about the restaurant again, about the moment that had seemed so abrupt, so public, so unnecessary. But now, it no longer felt unnecessary. It felt like a test, a way to confirm something, to see how I would respond, whether I would react, create a scene, draw attention in a way that could be used later, framed differently, explained to others in a way that supported a narrative I had not yet fully seen. And I had not done that. I had remained quiet, composed. I had left. That detail mattered. I could feel it. Because if this had been part of something larger, then my response had not given her what she expected. I turned away from the window, my reflection fading behind me, and returned to the table, gathering the folders one by one, placing them back into the cabinet with care. Not because I wanted to forget what I had seen, but because I no longer needed to search for it in these pages alone. The pattern was no longer hidden. It was present in every interaction, every adjustment, every carefully controlled moment I had once dismissed as coincidence. I closed the cabinet and rested my hand on the handle for a brief second, allowing the stillness to settle again. There was no urgency in what I felt. No panic. Only a quiet understanding that whatever had been set in motion had not yet reached its conclusion. And neither had I. I moved back into the living room, turning off the lamp this time, letting the house fall into darkness, not as a retreat, but as a choice. Because now, I was no longer reacting to what had been done. I was preparing to understand what would come next. And more importantly, I was beginning to consider how I would respond when it did. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning, not because I had slept well, but because my mind had already moved ahead of me, organizing thoughts before I could even open my eyes. The house was quiet in that familiar way that used to comfort me, but now it felt like an advantage, a space where nothing interfered with clarity. I did not rush to the kitchen. I did not reach for coffee. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting the stillness settle into me, the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from decision. Because something had shifted during the night. Not in them. In me. I was no longer trying to make sense of what had already happened. I was beginning to think about what would happen next. I moved through the house slowly, deliberately, as if each step marked a new boundary I was choosing to cross with intention rather than habit. When I reached the kitchen, I prepared breakfast with the same care I always had, but I noticed something different in the way I moved. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. Even the smallest actions felt precise, as if I were reclaiming control over details I had once allowed to drift. I sat at the table with my plate in front of me, untouched for a moment, and looked out the window as the morning light spread across the yard. Everything outside appeared unchanged. The same trees, the same quiet street. But I knew better now. Change does not always announce itself. Sometimes it settles quietly into place, waiting to be recognized. I finished eating without distraction, then stood up, rinsed my plate, and dried my hands slowly, my mind already outlining the steps I needed to take. Not impulsive steps, not emotional ones, measured ones. I returned to the living room and reached for my phone again, not with uncertainty this time, but with purpose. There were conversations I needed to revisit, not to confront, but to observe more carefully. I scrolled through recent messages, paying attention to tone, to timing, to what was said and what was avoided. Patterns began to reappear immediately. Responses delayed just long enough to feel natural. Replies that redirected rather than answered. Language that created distance without appearing cold. It was subtle, but now that I was looking for it, it was unmistakable. I set the phone down and leaned back slightly, considering what those patterns meant in a broader sense. Communication is never just about words. It is about positioning, about who holds information, who controls timing, who decides what is shared and what is withheld. And in that dynamic, I could see clearly now where I had been placed. Not excluded entirely. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I had been kept just close enough to remain involved, but never close enough to influence anything that mattered. I stood up again and walked to the hallway, this time not to open the cabinet, but to pass it. I already knew what was inside. What I needed now was not more confirmation. It was perspective. I picked up my coat from the chair near the door and stepped outside into the morning air, the cool breeze sharp enough to bring a different kind of focus. The neighborhood was quiet, a few cars passing in the distance, the rhythm of an ordinary day beginning. I started walking without a specific destination, letting the movement help organize my thoughts. As I moved down the street, I considered the one element I had not yet fully examined. Daniel. Not just his behavior, but his position within all of this. It would be easy to see him as passive, as someone simply following Ashley's lead. But that would be too simple. People do not surrender control entirely without reason. There is always an exchange. Something gained in return for what is given up. I thought about his work, the long hours, the pressure he had mentioned more frequently over the past year. I thought about the way Ashley often spoke about financial decisions, about planning, about efficiency, always framing changes as improvements, as progress. It was possible, even likely, that what had begun as small adjustments had gradually become something larger, something that now felt normal to him, something he no longer questioned. That realization did not excuse his silence, but it explained it. And understanding the structure meant I could begin to see where it might be altered. I slowed my pace as I reached the end of the block, turning the corner without thinking, my mind already moving ahead. If Ashley had been building control through small, consistent steps, then dismantling that control would require the same approach. Not confrontation, not exposure, at least not yet. Precision, observation, timing. I stopped briefly at a crosswalk, waiting for a car to pass, and in that pause, a new thought settled into place. The restaurant had not just been a test of my reaction. It had also been a display, a way to reinforce a narrative in front of witnesses, to create an impression that could be referenced later if needed. But narratives can be challenged, not by arguing against them, but by presenting something stronger, something grounded in evidence rather than emotion. I continued walking, the rhythm of my steps steady, my thoughts aligning with a clarity I had not felt in a long time. I was not interested in proving them wrong through words. Words can be twisted, reframed, dismissed. What I needed was something that could not be easily altered, something that spoke for itself. I turned back toward my house, the decision forming quietly but firmly. I would not confront Ashley. Not yet. I would not question Daniel directly. Not until I understood the full extent of what had been set in motion. For now, I would do something far more effective. I would watch. I would listen. And when the time came, I would act in a way that left no room for interpretation. As I stepped back onto my driveway, the morning sun fully risen now, I realized that for the first time since that night, I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me. I was preparing for what I would choose to do next. By the time I stepped back inside the house, the morning had already settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind that usually passed unnoticed, but now every detail felt sharper, more defined, as if the world itself had slowed down just enough for me to see the spaces in between. I hung my coat carefully, aligning it with the others, a small act that mirrored the precision forming in my thoughts. Nothing about what I was doing felt rushed. That was the difference now. Before, I reacted. Now I observed. I moved into the living room and sat down, not out of habit, but with intention, my phone resting in my hand as I considered the next step. Watching and listening were not passive actions. They required structure. They required attention to timing, to consistency, to the patterns that revealed themselves only when you stopped looking for immediate answers. I opened my messages again, not to read them from the beginning, but to examine the most recent ones more closely. There was a message from Daniel sent late the previous night, hours after I had left the restaurant. "Hope you got home safe," it read. Simple, polite, neutral. I stared at it for a moment, not focusing on the words themselves, but on what was missing. There was no acknowledgement of what had happened. No mention of the scene. No attempt to explain or even soften it. Just distance, carefully maintained. I did not respond. Not yet. Instead, I set the phone down and leaned back, letting the silence stretch. Silence, I realized, was not empty. It was revealing. People fill silence when they feel pressure. They reveal themselves when they believe they are not being watched. And for the first time, I understood that my role was not to interrupt that process, but to allow it to unfold. Later that afternoon, the phone rang. I did not move immediately. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Then I answered. Daniel's voice came through, steady, measured, almost too controlled. "Mom," he said. I did not respond right away. I let the pause settle between us. "I wanted to check in," he continued. "About last night." There it was. Not an apology, not concern, just a reference, carefully phrased. "I am fine," I said, my voice even, calm, giving him nothing to react to. Another pause followed. Slightly longer this time. "Ashley was under a lot of stress," he added, the explanation. Arriving exactly where I expected it would. I closed my eyes briefly, not out of frustration, but to listen more closely. Not to his words, but to the structure behind them. This was not spontaneous. This was rehearsed. "I see," I replied simply. I did not ask questions. I did not challenge him. I did not give him the opportunity to expand on a narrative that was already taking shape. Silence again. Then he shifted. "We are having a small gathering this weekend," he said. "Just a few people. Thought you might want to come." I opened my eyes and looked straight ahead, my reflection faint in the dark screen of the television across the room. A gathering. So soon. The timing was not accidental. It aligned too neatly with everything else. A public moment followed by a controlled setting. A chance to reinforce, to reshape, to present something. "That sounds nice," I said, my tone unchanged. "What time?" He told me. I listened. I agreed. And then I ended the call without adding anything more. I set the phone down slowly, my fingers resting lightly against the surface of the table. This was it. Not the conclusion, but the next step in whatever had been set in motion. The gathering would not be casual. It would be structured, just like the dinner had been. The difference was that now, I was aware of it. I stood up and walked to the window again, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. I thought about the restaurant, about the way Ashley had watched me, the way she had measured my reaction. That same evaluation would happen again. Different setting, different audience, same purpose. But this time, the outcome would not be as predictable. I turned away from the window and moved toward the hallway, stopping briefly at the cabinet, my hand resting on the handle without opening it. I did not need to. The information was already with me. What mattered now was how it would be used. I continued past it and into the bedroom, opening the closet and looking at the rows of neatly arranged clothing. For a moment, I simply stood there, considering. This was not about appearance. Not entirely. But appearances. Shape perception. And perception, in situations like this, is often the first layer of control. I selected a dress carefully, something simple, understated, but precise in its detail. Nothing that demanded attention. Nothing that suggested effort. Just enough to ensure that I was seen exactly as I intended to be seen. I closed the closet and returned to the living room, the quiet of the house settling around me once more. There was no urgency in what I felt. No need to rush ahead. Everything would unfold in its time. And when it did, I would be ready, not because I had forced the moment, but because I had allowed it to reveal itself fully before stepping into it. I sat down again, my posture relaxed, my mind clear, and for the first time since that night, I allowed a small, almost imperceptible shift in my expression. Not a smile, not satisfaction, just recognition. Because whatever Ashley believed she had set in motion, she had done so under the assumption that I would remain exactly who I had always been. Quiet, compliant, unquestioning. And that assumption, more than anything else, was where she had made her first mistake. I did not arrive early this time. That was the first change I made. In the past, I would have come ahead of everyone else, giving myself time to settle, to prepare, to make sure everything felt right before they walked in. But this time, I arrived exactly on time. Not a minute sooner. Not a minute later. The house looked the same from the outside, quiet, well-kept, the front porch light casting a warm glow that suggested something welcoming. Inside, I knew better. When Daniel opened the door, his expression shifted almost immediately, a brief flicker of surprise before it settled into something more controlled. "Mom," he said, stepping aside. I nodded once and walked in, my posture straight, my movements unhurried. The living room was already full. A small gathering, just as he had described. A few familiar faces. A couple I did not recognize. Conversations paused for a second when I entered, then resumed, softer this time, more aware. Ashley stood near the center of the room, her back partially turned, speaking to someone with that same composed ease I had come to recognize. When she noticed me, she did not react immediately. She finished her sentence, smiled at the person in front of her, then turned slowly, as if my arrival had been expected but not urgent. "You made it," she said, her tone light, almost pleasant. There was no trace of the restaurant in her voice. No tension, no apology, just control. "Of course," I replied, equally calm. I allowed my gaze to move briefly across the room, taking in the details. The arrangement of the furniture, the placement of the chairs, even the way people were positioned, some closer to Ashley, others slightly apart, as though the space itself had been organized with intention. Daniel hovered nearby, not too close, not too distant, his presence carefully balanced. I stepped further into the room, greeting a few people politely, my voice steady, my expression composed. No one mentioned what had happened before. No one needed to. It was there, beneath the surface, shaping the way eyes lingered just a second longer, the way conversations adjusted when I passed by. I took a seat near the edge of the room, not isolating myself, but not placing myself at the center either. I was not here to participate in the performance. I was here to observe it. Time moved slowly, each moment revealing small details that confirmed what I had already begun to understand. Ashley guided the conversation without appearing to. She shifted topics, redirected attention, introduced small comments that shaped how others responded. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. And now I did. At one point, she laughed lightly, placing her hand on Daniel's arm, drawing him into a story that positioned her as calm, reasonable, composed. He followed her lead without hesitation, his responses aligning perfectly with the tone she set. It was seamless, practiced. And then, just as I expected, the focus shifted. Not abruptly, not obviously, just enough for the room to adjust. "Margaret," Ashley said, turning slightly toward me, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention without raising it. "I hope you are feeling better today." There it was. Not an apology. Not concern. A statement framed as kindness, but placed carefully in front of an audience. I looked at her, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "I feel just fine," I said, my voice even, leaving no space for interpretation. A brief pause followed. Small, controlled, but noticeable. Someone nearby shifted in their seat. Another person glanced between us. Ashley smiled again, but this time, it did not reach her eyes. "That is good to hear," she replied, her tone unchanged. But something in the air had shifted. Slightly. Enough to be felt. I leaned back in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap, and allowed the silence to settle before it was filled again by other voices. This was the moment she had been preparing for. Not confrontation. Not conflict. Presentation. A narrative reinforced through subtle cues, through carefully placed remarks, through the absence of direct acknowledgement. But narratives rely on consistency, and consistency can be interrupted. I did not speak again for a while. I did not need to. Observation, in this moment, was more powerful than participation. I watched the way Ashley moved, the way she adjusted her tone depending on who she addressed, the way she positioned herself slightly ahead of Daniel when conversations involved decisions or opinions. I noticed the way others responded to her, not with resistance, but with acceptance, as if the structure she had created felt natural to them. That was the strength of what she had built. It did not appear forced. It appeared inevitable. And that was where it could be challenged. Because inevitability is only convincing until something disrupts it. As the evening continued, I became aware of another detail. A small one, but significant. Near the edge of the room, on a side table, there was a phone propped up against a decorative object, its camera facing the group. It was not hidden, but it was not announced either. Recording, perhaps, or streaming. I could not be certain, but its presence confirmed something I had already suspected. This was not just a gathering. It was documentation, a way to capture moments, to preserve impressions, to shape how events could be described later. I stood up, slowly, my movement drawing a brief glance from Ashley, who quickly masked it with another smile directed elsewhere. I walked across the room, not toward her, but toward the table where the phone rested. I did not touch it. I did not need to. I simply paused there for a moment, letting my presence be noted, my awareness unspoken but unmistakable. Then I turned and walked back to my seat, my expression unchanged. That was enough, because now the performance had a new variable. Not confrontation, not disruption, just awareness. And awareness changes everything. I sat down again, my posture relaxed, my gaze steady, and allowed the evening to continue. But I was no longer part of the scene she had prepared. I was something else entirely, something she had not accounted for. And as the conversations resumed, as the carefully balanced atmosphere tried to settle back into place, I could feel it, subtle but undeniable. The structure was still standing, but it was no longer stable. The evening did not collapse. That was the first thing I noticed. Nothing dramatic happened. No raised voices. No visible confrontation. From the outside, everything remained composed, controlled, exactly as it had been designed to appear. And yet, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone who was not paying close attention, but I could see it in the way Ashley adjusted her posture more frequently, in the way her eyes moved just a fraction faster across the room, checking, measuring, recalibrating. Awareness had entered the space, and it had not come from her. I remained seated for a while longer, allowing the conversations to continue around me, my presence steady, unchanged. I did not challenge her. I did not expose anything. I did something far more unsettling. I did not play my assigned role. That absence, that quiet refusal to react the way she expected, created a space she could not easily fill. Eventually, Daniel approached me, his steps hesitant but deliberate, as though he had been preparing himself for this moment throughout the evening. He stood beside my chair for a second before speaking, his voice low enough that others would not hear. "Mom," he said, "are you okay?" I looked up at him, taking in the details I had once overlooked. The slight tension in his shoulders. The way his gaze did not hold mine for long. The careful distance he maintained even while standing close. "I am," I replied simply. He nodded, but the nod felt incomplete, as if it were meant to close a conversation that had not actually happened. "Ashley was worried," he added, the words arriving with the same practiced ease I had come to recognize. I did not respond immediately. I let the silence settle between us, not as a barrier, but as an invitation for him to continue if he chose to. He did not. That told me more than anything he could have said. "You have a lovely home," I said instead, my tone calm, redirecting the conversation in a way that seemed natural, but carried its own quiet intention. He blinked slightly, caught off guard by the shift. "Thank you," he said. "We have been making some changes." I nodded once, my gaze steady. "I can see that." He hesitated, as if there were something more he wanted to say, something just beyond his reach, but then he stepped back, the moment passing without resolution. That, too, was part of the pattern. Moments that almost opened, then closed before anything real could be revealed. I watched him return to Ashley, the two of them exchanging a brief glance, something silent passing between them that did not need words. Coordination, alignment, reinforcement. The structure was still there, but it was no longer unquestioned. As the evening moved toward its natural conclusion, People began to gather their things, conversations softening into polite goodbyes, the carefully maintained atmosphere gradually loosening as the need to perform faded. I stood up when it felt appropriate, not drawing attention, not lingering unnecessarily. Ashley approached me then, her expression composed, her smile precise. "Thank you for coming," she said, her tone warm enough to sound sincere, but measured enough to remain controlled. I met her gaze directly, holding it for just a moment longer than politeness required. "Of course," I replied. No accusation, no emotion, just acknowledgement. For a brief second, something in her expression shifted. Not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice. But I saw it. A flicker of uncertainty. Small, controlled, but real. She had expected resistance. Or weakness. Or confusion. She had prepared for those outcomes. She had not prepared for this. Daniel walked me to the door, his movements automatic, his words minimal. "Drive safe," he said as he opened it. I nodded once and stepped outside, the cool night air meeting me with the same quiet steadiness it had days before. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and for a moment, I stood there, looking at the house, the light still glowing in the windows, the shape of it unchanged. But I knew better now. Structures do not collapse all at once. They shift. They adjust. They reveal their weaknesses slowly, often in ways that only become clear when you stop trying to hold them together. I walked to my car, my steps unhurried, my thoughts calm. I did not feel victorious. That was not what this was. Victory implies an end, a conclusion. This was something else. A turning point. I started the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, my reflection